Hi everyone, today we'll be going over Accounts 2023 Specimen Paper 2 question number 4. So there are slight changes in Paper 2 from examination for 2023 onwards. Previously we used to have 4 questions, 2 of 30 marks and 2 of 15 marks, and we had a time limit of 1 hour 30 minutes. But in this case we're going to have 4 questions, again 2 of 30 marks and 2 of 15 marks, but we'll be given time limit of 1 hour and 45 minutes, which means that we will be getting extra 15 minutes for the same weightage. And since question number 4 is of 30 marks, ideally we should be spending about 35 minutes in order to complete this question. And in this video as well, we will be attempting to solve this question under 35 minutes. So without any further delay, let's get started. Z Limited is a manufacturing company. It operates 2 production departments and 2 service departments. The costs are allocated to each department as follows. So we have 2 production departments, machining and finishing, and 2 service departments, stores and canteen. And we're given the indirect labor and other indirect overhead costs for all 4 departments. Then the cost of service departments are to be apportioned to other departments as follows. So canteen, we are to apportion it in proportion to the number of employees. All right, number of employees, we have it right here. So we will be apportioning the total overhead or total indirect cost of canteen, which is 170,000, to machining, finishing, and stores based on these number of employees. And we can just ignore the employee for canteen while apportioning it. And for stores, we are to apportion it in proportion to the number of stores requisition, which is given right here. Okay, let's have a look at our question. We need to apportion the service department cost by completing the table. Alright, the first one is reapportionment of canteen costs, which is to be done according to our proportion of number of employees. So let's figure out the total number of employees in machining, finishing, and store department. So that's going to be 5 plus 9 plus 3, which results in 17. Alright, and now we just need to divide this 170. So for machining, that's going to be 170,000, which is the total indirect cost of canteen. And in our machining department, we're going to get 5 out of the total of 17. So that's 5 divided by 17, which results in the reapportionment of canteen costs toward machining department to have the value of 170,000 times 5 by 17, which is 50,000. Let's write it down. Now we just repeat the same process for finishing and stores as well. For finishing, that's going to be the total cost of 170,000 times the proportion is now going to be 9 out of 17. So that's times 9 by 17, which results in reapportionment of canteen cost in our finishing department to have the value of 90,000. Let's write it down. And for stores, that's going to be the total of 170,000 times the proportion is 3 out of the total of 17. So that's times 3 by 17, which results in the reapportionment of canteen cost towards stores to have the value of 30,000. Okay. And now we just need to total our indirect costs for machining, finishing, and stores department. And one thing we should not forget is to subtract the same amount from canteen, since we have divided this amount into these 3 other departments. So we need to deduct the same amount from the canteen, right? So that's 170,000, but in a bracket. Now let's total these 2 rows for all 4 departments. For machining, that's going to be 458,000 plus 50,000, which results in 508,000. For finishing, that's going to be 565,100 plus 90,000, which results in 655,100. For stores, that's going to be 132,000 plus 30,000, which results in 162,000. And for canteen, that's 170,000 minus 170,000, which results in 0. Now, the next thing we need to do is to reapportion the cost of stores, which we just figured out to be 162,000, to our machining and finishing department. And it is to be done in proportion of number of store requisitions, which is given right here. So let's figure out the total number of store requisition first. That's going to be 6,300 plus 7,200, which results in 13,500. So that's going to be our proportion. And for machining department, we're going to apportion the total of 162,000. And the proportion for machining department is 6,300 out of the total of 13,500. So that's going to be times 6,300 divided by 13,500, which results in the reapportionment of stores in our machining department to have the value of 75,600. Let's write it down. Now we repeat the same process for finishing department. We have our total cost of stores to be 162,000. And the proportion for finishing department is 7,200 out of the total of 13,500. So that's times 7,200 divided by 13,500, which results in the reapportionment of stores in our finishing department to have the value of 86,400. Let's write it down. Now the last thing we need to do is to subtract the same amount from stores, because we already reapportioned this amount among our machining and finishing department. So that's going to be 162,000, but in a bracket. Now let's figure out the total apportioned cost. That will be the sum of these two rows. For machining, that's 508,000 plus 75,600, which results in 583,600. For finishing department, that's 655,100 plus 86,400, which results in 741,500. And for stores, that's going to be 162,000 minus 162,000, which results in 0. This concludes the first part of this question. We can now move towards the second one. We now need to calculate to 2 decimal places a suitable overhead absorption rate for each of the production departments. And for our overhead absorption rate, we just divide the total apportioned cost by our either the machine hour or labor hour. And in order to figure out whether to divide by our machine hour or labor hour, we just need to compare those. Okay, so let's compare it. We have our direct labor hours and machine hours right here. For machining, we can see that the direct labor hours is 15,000 and machine hours is 45,000. And we always pick the greater or higher amount. In this case, the higher one is our machine hours, which means that for machining department, our overhead absorption rate will be based on machine hours. Let's compare for finishing department. We have our direct labor hours to be 40,000 and machine hours to be 25,000. Again, the higher amount is the direct labor hours, which means that the overhead absorption rate for finishing department is based on labor hours. Okay, let's figure out the overhead absorption rate for machining department. Like I said before, we just divide the total overhead or the total apportioned cost, which we figured out right here. That's 583,600 for machining. And then we divide by either the labor hour and machine hour. And we already concluded that the higher one for machining department is machining hours. So we just divide it by 45,000. So our machining department's overhead absorption rate is going to be 583,600 divided by 45,000, which results in 12.97. And we need to clearly mention which one it is based on. And in this case, that's per machine hour. Now let's repeat the same process for finishing department. Our total overhead is 741,500. And then we need to divide it by either our direct labor hours and machine hours. And in case of finishing department, we can see that direct labor hours has the higher number. So we're just going to divide it by 40,000. In this way, finishing department's overhead absorption rate is going to be 741,500 divided by 40,000, which results in 18.54. And this is based on our direct labor hours. So that's per labor hour. This concludes the second part of this question. We can now move towards the third one. We are given additional information. Z Limited has been approached by a customer to quote for one of their products, and this will require the following. So we require direct materials of 20 kilos at $5 per kilo, direct labor of 8 hours at $9 per hour, and then the direct labor hours and machine hours required in each department will be, we're given the information for machining as well as finishing department. Then it is the company's policy to achieve a gross margin of 40% on all its products. And gross margin just means that our gross profit as compared to the selling price times 100% should be 40%. Okay, and for the third question, we need to figure out the total price to quote to the customer. And in order to figure out the total price, we first need to figure out our total cost. So we'll be starting there. Let's prepare a statement. Let's figure out our direct materials. And we are given the information regarding it right here. We require 20 kilos at $5 per kilo. So the total direct materials cost is just going to be 20 times $5, which results in 100. Now we can include our direct labor. again, it's given right here. We require 8 hours at the rate of $9 per hour, which means that our total direct labor is going to be 8 times $9, which results in 72. Now we also need to add in our overheads for machining as well as finishing department. So let's start with machining department overhead. And we will be utilizing the overhead absorption rate that we figured out above. We can see that for machining department, our overhead absorption rate was 12.97 per machine hour. So in order to figure out the total overhead, we just need to multiply this absorption rate of 12.97 to our machine hours. And for machining, the machine time, which is equivalent to machine hours, is 2. So we're just going to multiply it by 2, which results in our machining department overhead to have the value of 25.94. Now we repeat the same process for our finishing department overhead. Let's have a look at our overhead absorption rate for finishing department. That was 18.54, and this is per labor hour. So in order to figure out the total overhead for finishing department, we just need to multiply this rate to the labor hour. Let's do that. So that is 18.54 times the labor hour, which is given to be 5 for finishing department. So that's times 5, which results in total finishing department overhead to be included to be 92.70. So now we can just total this and figure out the total cost. So that's total cost. Let's add these four amounts. That's 100 plus 72 plus 25.94 plus 92.70, which results in 290.64. But we need to figure out the total price to quote, which is the selling price, right? And in order to figure out this selling price, we'll be utilizing this relation. And we know that gross profit is just selling price minus cost price, right? Divided by selling price times 100 is 40%. Now we need to figure out the selling price, but we already figured out our cost to be 290.64. So let's substitute that. Selling price minus 290.64 divided by selling price is 40 by 100, which you can write down as 0.40. Let's multiply this to the other side. That will be selling price minus 290.64 equals to 0.4s. Now let's bring this to this side and this to the other side. That is going to be selling price minus 0.4 selling price equals to 290.64. Let's take our selling price as common. That will be 1 minus 0.4, which results in 290.64. So our selling price is just going to be 290.64 divided by 1 minus 0.4, which is 0.6. In this way, our selling price is going to be 290.64 divided by 0.6, which results in 484.40. This is the price to quote. So let's write it down. And we figure out the price to quote by adding our gross margin. And this is the price to quote, which we figured out to be 484.40. And the gross margin is just the difference between these two amounts, right? So that's 484.40 minus 290.64, which results in 193.76. This concludes the third part of this question. Now let's move towards the fourth one. We're given additional information. The customer has said they will buy goods from Z Limited, but at a price which will earn Z Limited a gross margin of 25%. So previously, we used to have a gross margin of 40%. Now we need to advise the directors whether or not they should accept this offer. So if the directors decide to accept this offer by accepting a gross margin of 25%, then the factory workers will have to work in order to produce these goods, which means that our workers will be employed. So that is a positive aspect. Let's write it down. Will ensure that workers are employed. And we can also figure out the selling price and see if there is any sort of contribution made or not. Because if our contribution is negative, then it is better to not accept the offer. So let's figure out our selling price at 25% gross margin. So that will be gross profit divided by selling price times 100. equals to 25%. And like I said before, gross profit is just the difference between selling price and cost, and we already figured out our cost to be 290.64. So that's divided by selling price equals to 25 by 100, which is 0.25. Let's solve this. So that's selling price minus 290.64 equals to 0.25 selling price. If this comes to this side, that's going to be s minus 0.25s, which results in 0.75s equals to 290.64. So our selling price is just going to be 290.64 divided by 0.75, which results in our selling price, if the gross margin is 25%, to be 387.52. Now let's see if there is any contribution made. Contribution is just the difference between selling price and variable cost. So our selling price is 387.52, and our variable cost is the direct material and direct labor, which is 172. Let's write it down. So that's 100 minus 72, which results in our contribution to be 215.52. So we can see that there is still a positive contribution made, right? So that is a benefit of accepting this offer. Let's write it down. A gross margin of 25% will still cover the variable costs and earn some contribution. But if we lower our gross margin for this one customer, then future customer may also expect a lower margin for them, right? That would be a disadvantage because the company would no longer be able to earn a gross margin of 40%. Let's write it down. It may lead to this customer looking for a lower margin. And again, like I said before, other customers may learn of the reduction in price and ask for their prices to be reduced as well. So that could also act as a disadvantage. Let's write it down. Other customers may learn of the reduction in price and all ask for their prices to be reduced. Now, based on these factors, we need to advise the directors whether or not they should accept the offer. Personally, I would say that they should accept the offer because some contribution is still earned, right? So let's write down the decision clearly. The directors should accept the offer. This concludes the fourth part. Now let's move towards the fifth one. We are again given additional information. Z Limited operates a second factory. It uses both direct labor hours and machine hours to absorb its factory overheads, and the cost accountant has suggested that a single factory-wide overhead absorption rate should be used instead. Now we need to advise the directors whether or not they should make this change. So if we adopt a single factory-wide overhead absorption rate, then obviously it's going to be way easier to calculate. Let's write it down. Easier to calculate a single factory-wide overhead absorption rate. And calculating a single factory-wide overhead absorption rate would also be cheaper, right? So that is also an advantage, cheaper to calculate. But we know that calculating a single factory-wide overhead absorption rate would also be less accurate. And this won't be wise because different products may use more direct labor hours than machine hours. Let's write it down. Different products may use more direct labor hours than machine hours. Now, based on these factors, we need to advise the directors whether or not they should make this change. Personally, I would advise the directors to not make this change because we know that a single factory-wide overhead absorption rate would not be very accurate, and that inaccuracy could also be reflected in the selling prices, which could lead to less profits being made by our company. Let's write it down. The directors should not make this change. This concludes the fifth part. Now we can move towards the sixth one. We need to discuss the impact of overabsorption of overheads on the profits of a manufacturing business. So the impact of overabsorption is that it means too much overhead is charged to the product. Let's write it down. Will mean too much overhead is charged to the product. And if too much overhead is being charged to the product, this brings the cost of the product to be higher, which also leads the price being charged to the customers to be higher for that particular product, right? Let's write it down. This may lead to a higher price being charged to customers. And if we have a higher price charged to customers, this also means that we have a higher profit margin, right? Let's write it down. Leading to increased profit. And since we have a higher selling price, there is always a negative relationship between selling price and demand, right? So the higher selling price could bring down our demand, right? And if the demand is very low for this product, then our profits will also be very low. Let's write it down. Higher selling prices could drive down the demand, causing lower profits to be earned. Alright, this concludes the fourth question of 2023 Specimen Paper 2. If you found this video useful, make sure you like the video and leave a comment below. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so that you do not miss any of these videos in the future. Thank you.